The village of St. Mead's was, to the casual observer, a perfect pocket of English tranquility. Nestled in a gentle fold of the countryside, its honey-colored stone cottages and meticulously tended gardens presented a picture of timeless order. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the very heart of this order, the Vicarage garden, was on display for the annual Summer Fete Planning Committee tea. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and freshly cut grass, and the gentle hum of polite conversation blended with the drowsy buzzing of bees. It was a scene Miss Jane Marple knew intimately. Seated in a wicker chair that offered a favorable view of both the rose arbor and the French windows to the vicarage drawing room, she appeared to be the archetypal village spinster, doing her duty by attending yet another committee meeting. Her hands, clad in fine grey lace gloves, rested calmly in her lap, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. To the others, she was simply old Miss Marple, perhaps a little dozy in the sunshine, her mind occupied with thoughts of delphiniums and the upcoming cake competition. The vicar, Leonard Peters, a man whose kindness often outpaced his organizational skills, fluttered between clusters of guests like an amiable moth. "More tea, Mrs. Henderson? Miss Marple, your cup is looking dreadfully empty." He beamed, his round face flushed with the effort of hostmanship. "Thank you, Vicar. It is a most refreshing blend," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze drifting past him to observe the other attendees. There was Colonel Arthur Wentworth, retired, holding forth near the herbaceous border on the deplorable state of the modern world, his voice a familiar, gravelly boom. His wife, Lavinia, sat beside him, a study in quiet endurance, her hands perpetually busy with a piece of embroidery, her eyes rarely lifting from her work. A few feet away, the vibrant crimson of a new tea gown marked the presence of Mrs. Eleanor Havisham, the widow of a wealthy industrialist and the committee's most generous and most demanding patron. She was holding court, her laughter a little too bright, her gestures a little too expansive for the subdued vicarage lawn. "The tombola simply must have more substantial prizes this year," Mrs. Havisham declared, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the arm of her chair. "Last year's assortment of homemade chutneys and knitted tea cozies was, frankly, a little pathetic. I, of course, will donate a case of my late husband's finest port." The vicar wrung his hands slightly. "That is most generous, Eleanor, most generous indeed, but we must be mindful of not overshadowing the contributions of others." His eyes flickered nervously towards Miss Hartwell, the village schoolmistress, who was known for her prickly pride and whose own donation was likely to be a modest basket of scones. Miss Beatrice Hartwell, a woman with a spine as rigid as her moral code, sniffed audibly. She sat a little apart from the main group, as if to physically distance herself from the vulgarity of showy wealth. "I've always found the homemade contributions to be the very soul of the fete," she said, her tone crisp. "They represent the community spirit." Mrs. Havisham waved a dismissive hand. "Community spirit doesn't fill the parish roof repair fund, my dear Beatrice. We need to attract people from Chipping Cleghorn, even from Market Basing. We need spectacle." It was then that a quieter figure emerged from the vicarage, carrying a replenished teapot. Clarissa Webb, the vicar's young niece, moved with a graceful diffidence that Miss Marple had always found rather touching. Orphaned and taken in by her uncle 2 years prior, Clarissa had the delicate beauty of a porcelain shepherdess and a temperament to match. She was painfully shy, her large, doe-like eyes seeming to take in the world with a constant, gentle anxiety. She began to refill cups, her movements silent and efficient. "Ah, Clarissa, my dear, there you are," the vicar exclaimed with genuine warmth. "We were just discussing the fete. You will play your part, won't you? Perhaps another recitation? Your Lady of Shalott last year was quite moving." A faint blush colored Clarissa's pale cheeks. "If you wish, uncle," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the teapot. Miss Marple watched as Colonel Wentworth gruffly accepted a fresh cup from Clarissa, his brusque manner softening for a fraction of a second. She also noted the way Miss Hartwell's stern expression tightened almost imperceptibly as the girl approached, and the way Mrs. Havisham's bright social smile did not quite reach her eyes when Clarissa poured her tea. It was all very subtle, the tiny shift in the atmosphere that occurs when a single figure connects, however briefly, with several others. Like a stone dropped into a pond, Miss Marple thought, and even the smallest stone sends out its ripples. The conversation ebbed and flowed around the usual topics. The unseasonable dampness of the summer, the scandalous price of Mrs. Darrow's eggs, and the mysterious disappearance of the Pargeter's prize-winning tabby. It was all so very normal. Miss Marple contributed little, offering only the occasional gentle comment on the hydrangeas or the quality of the vicar's seed cake. She was, as always, listening and watching, her mind a neat filing cabinet for human idiosyncrasy. It was during a lull that Clarissa, having finished her duties with the teapot, took a small personal cup of tea for herself from a tray on the wrought iron table. She sat on a modest bench near Miss Marple, sighing softly as if relieved the serving was over. For a few minutes, she sipped quietly. Then she paused, a slight frown creasing her brow. She took another, more tentative sip. "Is something the matter, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, gently. "The tea is not too cold, I hope. I find it turns so quickly outdoors." Clarissa looked up, her expression one of mild confusion. "No, it's not that, Miss Marple. It's just, it has a most peculiar taste. Rather bitter. Perhaps the leaves were overbrewed." Before Miss Marple could respond, Mrs. Havisham's voice cut across the lawn. "Nonsense, child. It's my own special blend, a gift to the vicar. A delicate Darjeeling with a hint of bergamot. Far too sophisticated for the common palate, I suppose." She laughed, but the sound had an edge to it. Clarissa flushed again, this time with embarrassment. "I'm sure it's lovely, Mrs. Havisham. My taste buds must be quite mistaken." She gave Miss Marple a small, apologetic smile and took another dutiful swallow. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply watched. 15 minutes later, the peaceful scene shattered. Clarissa, who had been growing progressively paler, suddenly stood up, a hand flying to her throat. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. Her eyes, wide with a sudden, terrified confusion, sought her uncle's. I can't," she gasped. "My chest. It feels so tight." She took one stumbling step before her legs gave way. The colonel, with a surprising alacrity for a man of his years, caught her as she fell. The delicate porcelain of her teacup, now empty, hit the flagstone path and shattered into a dozen pieces. Pandemonium, of the quiet, horrified English variety, ensued. The vicar cried out, rushing to his niece's side. Lavinia Wentworth dropped her embroidery. Miss Hartwell stood rigid, a hand clamped over her mouth. Mrs. Havisham's dramatic gasp was the loudest sound of all. But Miss Marple, from her vantage point in the wicker chair, remained perfectly still. Her eyes were not on the tragic, crumpled form of Clarissa Webb, nor on the frantic vicar, nor on the shocked faces of the committee. They were fixed on the scattered, pearlescent shards of the teacup on the sun-dappled path, and the few damp, bitter leaves that clung to them. "A peculiar taste," the girl had said. "A most peculiar taste." The following day, a pall of shock lay over St. Mead's, as thick and suffocating as the morning fog that clung to the water meadows. The news had spread with the ruthless efficiency peculiar to villages, passed over garden fences, whispered in the post office queue, and discussed in hushed, solemn tones in the corner shop. Clarissa Webb was not merely unwell, she was dead, and it was not a tragic, natural passing. The doctor, summoned from his lunch, had taken one look at the body's contorted posture and the livid hue of the skin and pronounced the unthinkable poison. In the Blue Boar Inn, the usual lunchtime chatter was replaced by a low, earnest hum. Farmers, shopkeepers, and labourers huddled over pints of bitter, their faces grave. "Poison," muttered old Mr. Pargeter, shaking his head. "In the vicar's own garden, it don't bear thinking about." "The girl was a quiet little thing," said Mrs. Darrow, the grocer's wife, her voice tinged with a macabre relish. "Never a cross word for anyone. Who'd want to do a thing like that to her?" Theories, of course, were already sprouting like weeds. The most popular and most readily accepted concerned a tragic mistake. "It was that Havisham woman's tea," declared the blacksmith, wiping foam from his mustache. "Some foreign muck, I'll be bound. Probably went off. A bad batch, that's what it was. A dreadful accident." This theory was both comforting and convenient. It allowed for shock and sympathy without the unsettling spectre of a murderer in their midst. An accident with some exotic blend was a story they could understand, a calamity that could be filed away without upending their entire world. But other, more sinister whispers also circulated. Miss Hartwell, visiting the village shop for a skein of wool, offered a different perspective. Her lips pursed as if she'd tasted something sour. A quiet thing, yes. But quiet waters run deep, as they say. One wonders what a young girl of her age might have been involved in. She received letters, you know, posted from Market Basing. I saw them myself in the vicar's post box. She left the implication hanging, a poisonous little seed of its own. Up at the vicarage, the atmosphere was one of profound grief and bewildered disruption. The police, in the form of Inspector Drew, a competent but unimaginative man from Market Basing, and his younger, more earnest sergeant, had taken over the morning room. The vicar moved through his own home like a ghost, his face ashen, his eyes red-rimmed. He had adored his niece, seeing in her a fragile legacy of his beloved late sister. The thought that her death was anything other than a terrible mistake was a torment he could not yet entertain. "It must have been the tea," he told the inspector, his voice trembling. "She said it tasted peculiar. Mrs. Havisham's blend. A dreadful, dreadful accident." Inspector Drew, a man who preferred the straightest line between 2 points, was inclined to agree. He had already sent the remaining leaves from the tin and the dregs from the shattered cup for analysis. "We'll know more soon, Vicar," he said, his tone professionally soothing. "In the meantime, we must treat this with the utmost seriousness." It was in this climate of gossip and official inquiry that Miss Marple paid a visit to Lavinia Wentworth. The Colonel's wife was not a close friend, but they moved in the same small circles of church and village life, and a call of condolence for the shock to the whole community, if not for a personal loss, was perfectly in order. Lavinia received her in the drawing-room of their comfortable, slightly shabby house on the edge of the village. The room was a testament to the Colonel's travels, crowded with brassware from India and faded samplers worked by long-dead relatives. Lavinia herself was pale but composed, her embroidery hoop, as always, in her hands. The needle moved in and out of the linen with a steady, practiced rhythm, a small anchor of normality in a sea of turmoil. "It is too horrible, Jane," Lavinia said, after the initial pleasantries had been exhausted. "To die like that at a tea party. It feels indecent." "It is a profound shock," Miss Marple agreed, sipping the excellent and very ordinary Indian tea she had been served. "The poor child, and the poor vicar." "He is quite broken," Lavinia murmured. "Arthur, the Colonel, was up there most of the morning offering support. He was very fond of Clarissa, you know. Thought of her almost as a daughter, I think." There was a faint, unreadable emotion in her voice as she said this, her eyes on her stitching. "It was he who caught her when she fell," Miss Marple observed gently. "He was very quick. His old military reflexes, I suppose," Lavinia said with a thin smile, "though they rarely extend to helping me with the dusting." She paused, her needle hovering. The talk in the village, of course, is all of Mrs. Havisham's tea. An accident. "It seems the most logical conclusion," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "Does it?" Lavinia's eyes met Miss Marple's for a brief moment before flickering away. Eleanor Havisham is a great one for fads and potions. She's always buying peculiar herbs and infusions from that little shop in Market Basing, the one that smells of incense. But, well, she was drinking from the same pot, wasn't she? And she is perfectly fine. It was a point that had also occurred to Miss Marple, a point that the accident theory struggled to accommodate. Perhaps Clarissa's cup was somehow contaminated separately, Miss Marple suggested, voicing the obvious counter-argument. A residue of soap or something of that nature. Perhaps, Lavinia conceded, but she did not sound convinced. She snipped a thread with a small, sharp pair of scissors. It is a mystery, and such a waste of a young life. She was so looking forward to the fete. She had asked Arthur if she could help him with the rifle range this year. He was going to teach her to shoot. She gave a little sigh. He was quite touched by the request. He said it showed spirit. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning over the conversation. Lavinia's subtle skepticism about the accident, her mention of the Colonel's fondness for the girl, the image of the robust, blustering Colonel and the delicate, shy Clarissa standing together at a rifle range, was a striking one. It spoke of a relationship that was, perhaps, more particular than one might have assumed. As she reached her own neat gate, she saw her neighbor, young Mrs. Baker, arranging a vase of flowers on her windowsill. Their eyes met, and Mrs. Baker, her face full of the day's drama, hurried over. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it awful? Poor Clarissa. They're saying it was poison for sure. The police have been asking all sorts of questions." "I'm sure they are just being thorough, my dear," Miss Marple said calmly. "Well, I saw that sergeant fellow talking to Miss Hartwell for ages," Mrs. Baker confided, lowering her voice. "And you know what she's like. I wouldn't be surprised if she's filling his head with nonsense. She never did like Clarissa. Jealous, if you ask me." "Jealous?" Miss Marple prompted, her interest piqued. "Of what?" "Well, of the vicar's attention, for one. Miss Hartwell always thought she was the vicar's right hand, you see, organizing everything. Then Clarissa came and started helping him with the parish books and the flower rota. Did it much more efficiently, too, from what I hear. And then there was the little matter of the organ." "The organ?" "Yes. Miss Hartwell has played the organ for 20 years. But last month, Clarissa started playing instead for the evening service. She had a much lighter touch," the vicar said. "It caused quite a stir, I can tell you. Miss Hartwell was absolutely livid. She hasn't set foot in the church since." Mrs. Baker, having delivered this juicy morsel, nodded sagely and returned to her flowers. Miss Marple went inside her quiet cottage. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out at her own tidy garden. A bitter taste in the tea, a shattered cup, a Colonel with unexpected reflexes and a particular fondness, a schoolmistress supplanted and seething with resentment, a wealthy widow with a penchant for exotic potions. It was, she thought, like looking at a patchwork quilt. Individually, the pieces were just scraps of cloth. An odd comment here, a snippet of gossip there. But laid out together, a pattern was beginning to emerge. A very disturbing pattern indeed. The accident theory, so comforting to the village, was beginning to look terribly flimsy. Someone in St. Mead's, someone who had taken tea and discussed tombola prizes, had intended for Clarissa Webb to die. The following morning, a pale, determined sun broke through the lingering clouds, its light doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over St. Mead's. The police presence became more official, more intrusive. A uniformed constable was now posted at the vicarage gate, and Inspector Drew's solid, dark blue motor car was a permanent fixture outside the Blue Boar. Miss Marple, adhering to the unshakable rhythm of village life, decided a visit to the village shop was in order. A need for baking powder and a new spool of gray thread provided the necessary pretext. The shop, run by the garrulous Mrs. Darrow and her perpetually flustered husband, was the true nerve centre of St. Mead's, far more so than the church or the pub. It was here that information was gathered, weighed, and distributed. The little bell above the door tinkled as she entered. The air was a familiar mixture of soap, spices, and the faint, earthy smell of potatoes. Mrs. Darrow, a woman built for comfort and conversation, was behind the counter, her usual voluble self somewhat subdued. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Dreadful business, isn't it? Simply dreadful." "It is indeed, Mrs. Darrow," Miss Marple agreed, placing her small wicker basket on the counter. "A terrible shock for everyone. How is the vicar bearing up?" "Poorly, from what I hear," Mrs. Darrow confided, leaning forward. "Dr. Proctor had to give him a sedative last night, and the police have been in and out all morning. That inspector was in here not an hour ago, asking about purchases." "Purchases?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes, wanted to know if anyone had bought anything unusual lately. You know, chemicals for the garden or poisons." She whispered the last word, her eyes wide. "As if anyone in St. Mead's would. I told him the strongest thing we sell is rat poison, and we've not sold a box of that since old Mr. Hemmings had trouble in his barn back in the spring." Miss Marple selected a spool of thread with careful deliberation. "I suppose they have to ask these questions. It is their job, though it does make one feel rather uneasy." "Uneasy? It's downright frightening," Mrs. Darrow exclaimed, forgetting to keep her voice down. "To think one of us... Well, it doesn't bear thinking about. The inspector, he seemed very interested in Mrs. Havisham's habits. Asked if she bought her special teas here. I told him no, she gets all that fancy stuff sent down from London or from that peculiar little health shop in Market Basing. The Emporium of Earthly Delights, or some such nonsense." Miss Marple made a soft, sympathetic sound. "It does seem the most likely source of an accidental contamination, does it not? An improperly labeled herb, perhaps." "That's what I said," Mrs. Darrow agreed, nodding vigorously. "But the inspector, he had a funny look on his face. Then he asked about Miss Hartwell." She lowered her voice again. "Wanted to know if she'd been in lately. And she had, just yesterday morning. Bought a bottle of ink and some writing paper. But then he asked if she'd bought any bitter almonds." A silence fell between them. Bitter almonds. The association was unmistakable, even to Mrs. Darrow, who was no student of toxicology but an avid reader of detective novels. "How very specific," Miss Marple murmured. "And had she?" "No, of course not. We don't stock such a thing, but the fact he asked, it sets a person to wondering, doesn't it?" Mrs. Darrow's expression was a mixture of horror and fascination. First Mrs. Havisham and her teas, then Miss Hartwell and her general disagreeableness. It's like he's narrowing it down. Miss Marple paid for her purchases and left the shop, her mind working steadily. The police were, as she had expected, focusing on the obvious. Mrs. Havisham's exotic blend and Miss Hartwell's known resentment provided clear, straightforward motives and opportunities. It was all very neat. Too neat. Her route home took her past the church. The lich gate was open, and on an impulse, she turned in, walking softly through the churchyard. The ancient graves, draped in ivy and moss, seemed to offer a perspective on the current turmoil. Human nature, in its essentials, changed very little. She was not surprised to see a figure standing before a recent, unmarked headstone, the final resting place of the previous vicar's wife. It was Colonel Wentworth. He stood ramrod straight, his hands clasped behind his back, but his usual bluster was gone. In the quiet of the churchyard, he looked his age, an old man, burdened and tired. "Good morning, Colonel," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle so as not to startle him. He turned, and for a moment, a complex emotion, something like guilt, or perhaps sorrow, flashed in his eyes before being replaced by his customary gruffness. Miss Marple. Morning. Paying your respects. In a manner of speaking, it is a peaceful place to think. Humph. Not so peaceful lately, he grunted, his gaze drifting back toward the vicarage, just visible through the trees. Damned awful business. That poor girl. It was very quick thinking of you to catch her as you did, Miss Marple said. You must have been very close by. I was. Talking to Lavinia about the roses. Saw the girl stagger. Instinct, I suppose. He cleared his throat, a harsh, uncomfortable sound. Fine young woman. Full of spirit underneath all that shyness. Wanted to learn to shoot, you know. Asked me just the other day if I'd teach her at the fete. So I had heard, Miss Marple said. It seems an unusual interest for someone of her temperament. Not at all, the colonel retorted, a flicker of his old fire returning. Showed she had grit, wanted to better herself, not just sit around embroidering samplers. A modern girl, it's a blasted shame. He seemed to remember where he was and checked his language, his face flushing. Did she have many interests? Beyond her duties for the vicar, I mean. The colonel shrugged his broad shoulders. She helped Lavinia with her flower arrangements sometimes. Had a good eye for color, she said. And she was always reading. Poetry, mostly. Tennyson. The Lady of Shalott. He fell silent for a moment, his jaw working. Seems fitting now, doesn't it? Cursed to see the world only through a mirror, and dying before she could really live in it. Miss Marple was taken aback by the poetic allusion coming from the colonel. It was a side of him she had never seen. That is a surprisingly lyrical observation, Colonel. He looked at her sharply, as if he'd said too much. Nonsense. Just a remembered line. Well, I must be off. Lavinia will be wondering where I've got to. He gave a curt nod and strode away, his footsteps loud on the gravel path. Miss Marple watched him go. The colonel's grief felt raw and genuine, but it was layered with something else. A defensiveness, a need to explain his connection to the girl. His mention of the poem was telling. It was not the sort of thing one simply remembered. It suggested a shared interest, a point of connection between the gruff old soldier and the vicar's poetic niece that was more intimate than anyone had suspected. As she turned to leave, her eye was caught by a flicker of movement in the vestry window of the church. A face, pale and narrow, peered out before quickly disappearing behind the curtain. Miss Hartwell. She had been watching them, watching the colonel. Walking home, Miss Marple pieced together the new scraps of cloth. The police were focusing on the tea and on Miss Hartwell's jealousy. The colonel was nursing a private, complicated grief, and Miss Hartwell was watching the colonel. It was a tangle of motives and observations, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear to Miss Marple. The poison that killed Clarissa Webb was not just in the cup. It was in the very air of St. Mead's, a miasma of long-held resentments, hidden affections, and bitter secrets. And the key to unraveling it all lay not in what was obvious, but in what was being so carefully hidden in plain sight. The inquest, held in the drafty village hall, was a grim and formal affair that served only to cement the public's unease. The medical evidence was presented in cold, clinical terms. Death resulted from acute cyanide poisoning, a substantial dose ingested orally. The analysis of Mrs. Havisham's special Darjeeling blend revealed nothing more toxic than a high concentration of bergamot. The fatal dose had not been in the teapot. Inspector Drew, solid and methodical, outlined the sequence of events. Clarissa Webb had poured her own tea from the pot, taken one cup, and then, some minutes later, had fallen ill and died. The poison, therefore, had been introduced after the tea was poured, but before it was drunk. It was in the cup itself. This revelation sent a fresh ripple of horror through St. Mead's. The accident theory was now utterly demolished. The murderer had been there, on the vicarage lawn, surrounded by friends and neighbors, and had slipped a lethal substance into a young girl's teacup. The obvious suspect, as the village was quick to deduce, was Beatrice Hartwell. The police, it seemed, agreed. In the days following the inquest, Inspector Drew was seen calling at Miss Hartwell's neat, severe cottage with a new sense of purpose. The gossip, fanned by Mrs. Darrow and others, took on a vindictive edge. She was always so sharp with the girl. Mrs. Darrow confided to a customer, her voice a thrilled whisper. Jealous of her position with the vicar. Everyone knows it, and she was there, right there on the lawn. She could have done it easily. But how? The customer, a farmer's wife, asked. You'd have to get the poison into the cup without anyone seeing. Oh, she's a sly one, is Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Darrow said with conviction. All that quietness, it's not natural. It hides a spiteful temper. I've seen it myself when she thought no one was looking. The case against the schoolmistress seemed to be building. It was known she had a key to the church vestry, where various cleaning supplies were kept. A determined person might find something there, the villagers reasoned. More damningly, her animosity towards Clarissa was an open secret. The matter of the organ, in particular, was cited as a powerful motive. To be publicly supplanted by a young, pretty newcomer was a deep humiliation for a proud woman like Beatrice Hartwell. Miss Marple observed this rush to judgment with a growing sense of disquiet. She happened to be in her front garden, ostensibly pruning a rose bush, when Inspector Drew emerged from Miss Hartwell's cottage. The schoolmistress stood in her doorway, her face a mask of pale, tight-lipped fury. She did not look like a guilty woman trying to maintain a facade. She looked like an innocent one being monstrously wronged. Your theories are as flimsy as your character, Inspector, she said, her voice carrying clearly on the still air. I had no quarrel with that girl, none whatsoever. The inspector touched his hat and walked away, his expression unreadable. Miss Hartwell caught sight of Miss Marple watching and, with a final furious glare, retreated inside and slammed her door. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid one of her quiet visits to the vicarage. The vicar looked more haggard than ever, the circles under his eyes like bruises. It is all too dreadful, Miss Marple, he said, pouring her a cup of tea with a hand that trembled slightly. The china, she noted, was a different, plainer set than the one used for the fete. To think that someone from our own community, and now poor Beatrice. I cannot believe it of her. I simply cannot. The police must follow the evidence as they see it, Miss Marple said soothingly. But it is often the case that the most obvious path is not the correct one. It reminds me of young Tommy West, the butcher's boy. Everyone was sure he'd stolen the church collection money because he was seen loitering near the vestry. But it turned out to be a magpie that had taken the shiny coins for its nest. The obvious suspect is not always the guilty one. The vicar managed a weak, grateful smile. Your comfort, Miss Marple, your faith in human nature is a tonic. But the evidence, they say the poison was in the cup. Clarissa poured her tea and then sat down. No one approached her. No one, that is, except... He trailed off, his face clouding with a new, more painful thought. Except, Miss Marple prompted gently. Well, except when she first poured it. She brought the cup over to me to ask if I thought the milk was still fresh. I told her it was fine. But that was before she sat down on the bench. After that, no one went near her. He shook his head. So you see, it must have been done before she sat down, while the cup was unattended on the tray for a moment, or perhaps something was already in the cup itself. Miss Marple's needles, which had been quietly clicking, stilled for a moment. Something in the cup itself, she repeated softly. That is a very interesting point, Vicar. A very interesting point indeed. She steered the conversation to less distressing topics, and soon took her leave. As she walked down the vicarage drive, she saw a familiar, broad-shouldered figure approaching. Colonel Wentworth, his expression grim. Miss Marple, he said, nodding curtly. Going to see the vicar? Ah, poor chap. Needs a bit of bolstering. This business with Hartwell has him rattled. It is a trying time for everyone, she agreed. Well, they've got the right person, in my opinion, the Colonel stated bluntly. That Hartwell woman, nasty, jealous piece of work. Always has been. I told Drew as much. Nipped it in the bud, this sort of thing, in my day. Firm discipline. It does seem to fit the facts, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. Though it is curious, isn't it? What is? Why Miss Hartwell would choose such a public method? She is, by all accounts, a careful and private person. To poison a girl in front of the entire planning committee seems recklessly bold. Almost theatrical. The Colonel stared at her. Theatrical? What are you talking about? The woman saw her chance and took it. Probably didn't think the girl would drop dead right there on the lawn. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded. But it is a point to ponder. Well, I must not keep you from the Vicar. Good day, Colonel. She continued on her way, leaving the Colonel standing somewhat perplexed on the drive. Her mind, however, was racing. The Vicar's comment about the cup being unattended before Clarissa sat down was crucial. It widened the field of opportunity considerably. And the Colonel's eagerness to see Miss Hartwell condemned was notable. He was a man who liked clear enemies and swift justice, but his vehemence felt a little too pointed, a little too eager to close the book on the matter. The case against Miss Hartwell was neat, logical, and satisfied the community's desire for a culprit. But as Miss Marple knew from a lifetime of observing human folly, the truth was rarely neat and never logical. Someone was hiding behind the obvious, using the village's readiness to condemn the schoolmistress as a shield. The real murderer was counting on everyone, including the police, to take the straight, obvious path. And Miss Marple had always preferred the winding, more interesting byways. The arrest of Beatrice Hartwell 2 days later sent a final, definitive shudder through St. Mead's. The official word, relayed by a triumphant Mrs. Darrow to anyone who would listen, was that a small, unlabeled vial had been found tucked at the back of a drawer in the schoolmistress's dressing table, containing a residue that tested positive for cyanide. It was, for Inspector Drew, the conclusive piece of physical evidence that cemented motive and opportunity into a solid, prosecutable case. The village, for the most part, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been identified, captured, and order could slowly begin to restore itself. The shock began to recede, replaced by a grim satisfaction. They had known it, of course. They had sensed the spite behind her starched collars and sharp tongue. Miss Marple, however, did not share in this communal catharsis. The news, delivered over the garden fence by a breathless Mrs. Baker, left her with a profound sense of unease. It was all too convenient. The vial, discovered so readily in a drawer, it felt like a piece of stagecraft, a prop placed for the police to find. That evening, she sat in her quiet parlor, the events of the tea party replaying in her mind like a kinematograph show. She closed her eyes, bringing the scene into sharp focus. The dappled sunlight, the murmur of voices, the clink of china. She saw Clarissa pouring her tea, carrying the cup to the vicar, his kind, distracted smile as he reassured her about the milk. She saw the girl then moving to the bench, sitting alone, apart from the main group. And then Miss Marple's eyes snapped open. She had remembered something, a tiny, fleeting moment she had witnessed, but had not, until now, truly seen. It was just after Clarissa had sat down, just before she had taken her first sip. A movement, a flash of crimson. Mrs. Havisham, in her vibrant tea gown, had been standing near the wrought iron table, laughing at something the Colonel had said. As she laughed, she had gestured with her left hand, a dramatic, sweeping gesture that was characteristic of her. Her heavy jade bracelet had caught the light, and in that same moment, her other hand, her right hand, had passed over Clarissa's teacup, which sat on the bench beside the girl. It had been the briefest of movements, so quick and natural it was utterly unremarkable. It could have been a coincidence of timing, a simple adjustment of her balance. But now, viewed through the lens of murder, it took on a sinister, new significance. Could it have been? Could the poison have been administered, not when the cup was unattended on the tray, but in full view of everyone by a hand so bold and so practiced in theatricality that no one even registered the act? The following morning, Miss Marple decided a visit to the vicarage was once again in order, this time under the guise of discussing the future of the summer fete. The vicar, though still pale, seemed somewhat eased by the arrest, the burden of uncertainty partially lifted. "It is a tragic business, Miss Marple, but we must trust in the law," he said, stirring his tea. "The police seem quite certain." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "It must be a great relief, though it does make one wonder. Why would Miss Hartwell keep the vial? It seems an extraordinary risk for such a careful woman to take." The vicar looked troubled. "I've wondered that myself. Perhaps she simply panicked, or perhaps she's not as clever as we all thought." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "Vicar, may I ask a strange question? That afternoon after the tragedy, what happened to the tea things?" "The police took almost everything," he said. "The teapot, the milk jug, the sugar bowl, the remains of Clarissa's cup, and the other cups. The ones the rest of us were using?" "Oh, those were collected by Mrs. Maple, my housekeeper. She washed them and put them away." "Why do you ask?" "It is of no consequence," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "Just the meandering thoughts of an old woman. The set is so pretty, it would be a shame for it to fall out of use because of unhappy associations." "It is a handsome set," the vicar agreed. "A wedding present from my aunt." "Spode. We only use it for special occasions." Miss Marple's heart gave a little leap. "Spode. Fine. Translucent china." She finished her tea and took her leave, her mind working busily. Her next stop was the tiny St. Mead's library, a single room attached to the post office. She asked the postmistress, who also served as librarian, for a recent household compendium. She spent a quarter of an hour poring over its pages, her finger tracing down columns of text until she found what she was looking for, a section on the properties of common household substances. She read it carefully, a slow, sure understanding dawning on her face. She then walked to the police station, a small brick building next to the forge. She asked to speak with Inspector Drew. He received her in his cramped temporary office, his manner patient but faintly condescending. "Miss Marple, what can I do for you? I assure you we have the matter well in hand." "I do not doubt it, Inspector," she said, settling herself in the chair he offered. "It is only... well, there is a small thing that has been troubling me. A matter of the cups." "The cups," he repeated, his impatience barely concealed. "Yes. You see, the vicar has a lovely Spode china set. Very fine, and I was thinking about poor Clarissa's cup, the one that was shattered. It had a most peculiar pattern on the inside just before it broke." Inspector Drew leaned forward, his interest momentarily caught. "A pattern? What sort of pattern?" "Oh, not a painted one," Miss Marple clarified. "A crystalline one. A sort of faint, whitish residue around the rim and the inner curve. I remember noticing it when she raised the cup to her lips. I thought at the time it must be a trick of the light, or perhaps a flaw in the glaze. But now I wonder." The inspector's face fell. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, the cup is in fragments. Our man from the lab examined them. There was no mention of any residue beyond the tea dregs." "Ah, but of course," Miss Marple said, nodding as if this confirmed her thoughts. "It would have dissolved almost instantly upon contact with the hot liquid. It would leave no trace behind. How very clever." "What would have dissolved?" Drew asked, a note of exasperation creeping into his voice. "Why, the poison, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her blue eyes wide and innocent. "If it were not in the tea and not in the milk or the sugar, and if no one approached the cup after it was poured, then the only place it could have been was on the cup itself. A fine, powdered substance, perhaps brushed onto the inner surface before the tea was ever poured. It would have been invisible on the delicate pattern of the china, and it would have taken a minute or two to fully dissolve and become potent, which explains why the poor girl did not taste it immediately. Inspector Drew stared at her. The theory was absurd, and yet it was chillingly plausible. It completely reframed the timeline of the murder. The poisoner hadn't acted on the lawn. They had prepared the stage beforehand. They had known which cup Clarissa would use. "That's an interesting theory, Miss Marple," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "But it's pure speculation, and it doesn't help Miss Hartwell's situation. She had the means and the motive. This crystalline residue you think you saw, it proves nothing." "No, it does not," Miss Marple agreed, rising to her feet. "It is, as you say, just the speculation of an old woman. But it does make one wonder, doesn't it? It means the murderer did not need to be bold or quick-fingered. They simply needed to be someone with access to the vicar's china cupboard and the cold, calculated foresight to prepare a death in advance." "Good day, Inspector." She left him sitting at his desk, a frown deepening on his face as he stared at the closed door. The case, which had seemed so neatly tied up, had just been prized open again, and by the most unlikely of instruments. He looked down at the file on his desk labeled Hartwell Beatrice. For the first time, a tiny, nagging doubt began to gnaw at the edges of his certainty. Inspector Drew was a man who disliked loose ends. Miss Marple's theory about the poisoned cup, while fanciful, had introduced a stubborn, nagging thread that refused to be woven into the tidy tapestry of his case against Beatrice Hartwell. He could not dismiss it outright. It spoke to a premeditation that felt at odds with the schoolmistress's purported crime of passion. A jealous woman might slip poison into a cup in a moment of opportunity, but would she meticulously prepare a specific piece of china days or hours in advance? It felt cold, architectural. Consequently, his investigation, which had been winding down, acquired a new, quieter intensity. He began re-interviewing witnesses, not about their movements on the lawn, but about their access to the vicarage in the days leading up to the tea. He dispatched his sergeant to make discreet inquiries at the Emporium of Earthly Delights in Market Basing, not about Mrs. Havisham's teas, but about any other villagers who might have purchased unusual substances. It was this renewed activity that sent fresh ripples of anxiety through St. Mead's. The relief that had followed Miss Hartwell's arrest began to curdle back into uncertainty. Miss Marple, observing this from her garden wall, knew the psychological pressure was mounting. People with secrets grew nervous when the police started asking different questions. She decided it was time to apply a little gentle pressure of her own. She found Lavinia Wentworth in the church, arranging a simple vase of lilies on the altar. The colonel's wife started slightly as Miss Marple's soft footsteps echoed in the empty nave. "Oh, Jane, you startled me. My apologies, Lavinia. The flowers are lovely. A tribute?" Lavinia's hands stilled on a lily stem. "In a way. For Clarissa, and for peace. This whole business has been so unsettling." She turned, her gaze earnest. "They say the police are having doubts about Beatrice. Is it true?" "I believe Inspector Drew is merely being thorough," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "It is a complicated affair. So many hidden connections. For instance, I had no idea your husband was quite so fond of poor Clarissa." A faint, rigid tension settled in Lavinia's shoulders. "Arthur has a soft spot for youth. He always wanted a daughter. He saw her as a project, someone to encourage. He mentioned he was going to teach her to shoot. It seems an unusual pursuit for a vicar's niece, and rather a dangerous one." Miss Marple let the last word hang in the cool, still air of the church. "Dangerous?" Lavinia gave a short, brittle laugh. "I suppose all hobbies have their risks, but Arthur is an excellent shot. Was, rather. He hasn't handled a rifle in years. She turned back to the flowers, her movements less graceful now, more abrupt. His eyesight isn't what it was. It is a pity he never had a child of his own to teach, Miss Marple mused, watching her carefully. The Colonel seems a man who would have valued a legacy. Lavinia Wentworth froze. Her back was to Miss Marple, but the older woman could see the line of her spine go stiff. When she spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. "What are you implying, Jane?" "Oh, nothing, my dear. Nothing at all. It just reminds me of a story from my youth. A couple I knew. The husband was very attentive to a young woman who had come to stay in the village. Everyone said he was like a father to her, but his wife, she saw a different future unfolding, one where she was pushed aside. It is a fear that can curdle the kindest of hearts." Lavinia turned slowly. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with a cold fire Miss Marple had never seen in her before. All the years of quiet endurance had been stripped away, revealing a core of steel and bitterness. "You know nothing about it," she whispered fiercely. "Nothing. To be a soldier's wife is to be a ghost in your own life. You follow, you arrange, you endure. You listen to stories of battles and men, and you smile. And then you grow old, and you become invisible, and then along comes a pretty, young, grateful thing, with her poetry and her wide, admiring eyes. And suddenly, he's alive again, talking of teaching her to shoot, of taking her to London, of a future that didn't include a faded, childless wife." Tears welled in her eyes, but she dashed them away angrily. "He was going to change his will, Jane. He told me so. A small bequest to see her right. The money that was to be my security, my little bit of independence after a lifetime of being his shadow. He was going to give it to her." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "So you see, I had a motive, a very good one, better than Beatrice Hartwell's silly jealousy over an organ, but I didn't kill her. I'm not a murderer. I simply watched my husband make a fool of himself, and I waited for the girl to inevitably break his heart. That was to be my revenge. But someone did the job for me." With that, she gathered her basket and walked out of the church, her head held high, leaving Miss Marple alone with the scent of lilies and the echo of a shattered marriage. The encounter left Miss Marple deeply thoughtful. Lavinia's confession was explosive. It provided a powerful, financially driven motive that far outstripped Miss Hartwell's. It also painted the Colonel in a new, rather sordid light. His fatherly affection had a price tag, and his wife had been poised to pay it. Later that evening, as Miss Marple was locking her front door, she saw a furtive movement in the lane. Peering through the lace curtain, she saw the Colonel himself, not in his usual brisk stride, but walking slowly, head down towards the churchyard. He carried a small, dark object in his hand. Intrigued, Miss Marple waited a moment before slipping out her back door and making her way quietly through her garden and into the lane, using the high hedges for cover. She saw him enter the churchyard and stop not by the old graves, but by a fresh mound of earth, the temporary resting place of Clarissa Webb awaiting a proper headstone. He stood there for a long time, a solid, dark silhouette against the twilight sky. Then he bent down, and she heard a faint, metallic click. When he straightened, he placed the object he was carrying, a small brass shell casing she now saw, at the head of the grave, a soldier's tribute. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. It was a gesture of genuine grief, there was no doubt. But as Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, she felt a fresh chill. Grief and guilt were often intertwined. The Colonel had loved the girl in his own flawed way, but his love had put her in a dangerous position, making her a threat to his wife. And now the object of that affection was dead. It was a classic, tragic pattern, one she had seen before in stories far removed from the quiet fields of St. Mead's. The secrets were coming to light, and they were darker and far more painful than anyone could have imagined. The news, when it broke the next morning, was not of a breakthrough in the poisoning, but of a new and violent crime. Colonel Wentworth had been shot. He was found by his gardener, slumped in the potting shed at the bottom of his garden, a small neat hole in his temple. The weapon, his own service revolver, lay on the floor beside his outstretched hand. A single, spent shell casing was nearby. Inspector Drew, his face a mask of grim frustration, stood in the drizzle outside the shed. The initial scene pointed overwhelmingly to suicide. A man, burdened by grief and perhaps a guilty conscience over the death of the girl he had loved, takes his own life. It was a sordid but tragically comprehensible end to the story. The village, still reeling from one death, now plunged into a fresh morass of scandal and speculation. The narrative shifted with breathtaking speed. The colonel, it was now whispered, had been the poisoner. Overcome with remorse after the arrest of an innocent woman, he had chosen the only honorable way out. The case, it seemed, was closing itself. Miss Marple, however, received the news with a profound and deepening sense of dread. She had seen the colonel at the graveside only hours before. His grief had been palpable, but it had not been the wild, desperate emotion of a man on the verge of self-destruction. It had been somber, contemplative, and there was the matter of the shell casing. She made her way to the Wentworth house, where a stunned and silent Lavinia was being attended to by the vicar and Dr. Proctor. Lavinia's face was a blank page of shock, all the fiery confession of the previous day wiped away. She moved like an automaton, accepting sips of water, her eyes seeing nothing. "The poor, poor woman," the vicar murmured to Miss Marple in the hallway. To lose her husband in such a way, and with such implications, it is beyond bearing. "It is indeed a terrible tragedy," Miss Marple agreed. "Inspector Drew believes it was suicide. What else can it be?" the vicar said, spreading his hands in a helpless gesture. The shed was locked from the inside. The gun was his. It seems he could not live with what he had done. Miss Marple did not answer. She was thinking of the colonel's hands, the hands that had caught Clarissa as she fell, the hands that had placed the brass shell casing on her grave. They were the steady, capable hands of a military man, a man who knew guns. Would such a man, choosing to end his life with his own service revolver, make such a mess of it? A shot to the temple was messy, uncertain. A soldier would typically place the barrel in his mouth, aiming upwards. It was a grisly thought, but in matters of murder, one could not afford to be squeamish. She waited until the vicar had returned to Lavinia's side. Then she slipped out the back door and made her way down the sodden garden path to the potting shed. A young constable stood guard outside, but he recognized the vicar's frequent visitor and after a moment's hesitation, allowed her a brief look inside. The scene was as described. A pool of dark, congealed blood on the packed earth floor. The faint, acrid smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. The revolver lay near the colonel's right hand, and there, a few inches away, was the spent shell casing. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the scene. Then she saw it, a tiny, almost invisible detail. On the rough wooden workbench, beside a tray of seedling pots, lay a single, long, grey hair. It was caught on a splinter of wood, so fine it was almost translucent. It was the exact color and texture of Lavinia Wentworth's hair. Her heart beat a little faster. She looked from the hair to the body, to the gun, to the locked door. A locked room. It was the oldest trick in the book, and one she had encountered in various forms throughout her life. It was not a perfect locked room, of course, a simple potting shed with a basic bolt. But it was enough to convince a harried inspector of suicide. She did not touch the hair. She simply turned and thanked the constable, then walked back to the house, her mind racing. Lavinia's confession in the church took on a new, terrifying significance. She had motive for Clarissa's murder, a powerful financial one. And now, with her husband dead by an apparent suicide that confessed to the crime, she was free. Free from the humiliating prospect of a young rival. Free from a marriage that had become a prison, and secure in her financial future. It was neat, devastatingly so. But something still nagged at Miss Marple, the poison in the cup. It required foresight, planning, access. Lavinia had access to the vicarage, of course. She was a frequent visitor, but would the long-suffering, embroidery-loving Lavinia have the cold nerve to meticulously poison a piece of china? The shooting felt like a crime of passion, or at least of desperate opportunity. The poisoning felt like something else entirely, something calculated and sly. 2 deaths, 2 different methods. One brutal and direct, the other subtle and insidious. They seemed to point to 2 different temperaments. But if Lavinia had killed Clarissa, then the Colonel's suicide made a twisted kind of sense. And if the Colonel had killed Clarissa, his suicide also made sense. But Miss Marple could not make herself believe either scenario. The pieces fit, but they fit too loosely. They clattered when you shook them. As she reached the Wentworths' back door, she paused, looking back at the tragic scene. The Colonel was a victim, she was sure of it. But of whom? And why had he been silenced? The shell casing on Clarissa's grave and the shell casing in the shed? They were a pair, a message. But who was it meant for? The case, which had seemed to be simplifying, had suddenly become a great deal more complex and far more dangerous. The murderer was still at large, and they had just committed a second, bolder crime right under the nose of the police. They were not just cunning, they were ruthless. And they believed they were safe, hidden behind the facade of a grieving widow and a closed case. Miss Marple knew she had to proceed with the utmost care. The next move she made would be her most critical. This response is AI-generated, for reference only. Continue. Part 8. Miss Marple's final test. The inquest into Colonel Wentworth's death returned a predictable verdict of suicide while of unsound mind, with a strong implication that he was responsible for the poisoning of Clarissa Webb. Inspector Drew, while not entirely comfortable, had no evidence to contradict the physical facts of the locked shed and the Colonel's own gun. The case was officially closed. St. Mead's began the slow, awkward process of healing. The 2 tragedies now woven together into a single, sordid tale of forbidden love and tragic remorse. Miss Marple, however, did not rest. The discovery of the grey hair in the potting shed had solidified her conviction of a second murder, but pointing the finger at the newly widowed Lavinia would require more than a single, fragile thread. It would require a confession, or at the very least, a critical, unguarded reaction. She needed to lay a trap, one so subtle that only the guilty party would sense its spring. She decided the perfect venue would be a small, quiet gathering at the Vicarage to discuss the future of the summer fete, a poignant echo of the fateful tea party. The vicar, though hesitant, agreed, believing it a necessary step towards normalcy. The attendees would be few: the vicar himself, Mrs. Havisham, Miss Marple, and, of course, Lavinia Wentworth. It was a risk, inviting the person she believed to be a murderer, but the controlled setting was essential. On the appointed afternoon, the 4 women sat in the vicar's drawing room. The spode china, at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, had been put away. They used a plain white Staffordshire set instead. The atmosphere was strained, thick with unspoken thoughts. Lavinia, dressed in unrelenting black, was a statue of quiet grief, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mrs. Havisham, perhaps sensing the tension, was uncharacteristically subdued. The conversation was desultory, circling around the fate without ever truly landing on it. After a suitable period, Miss Marple saw her opportunity. "It is all so very sad," she began, her voice soft and ruminative. It puts me in mind of a story from my youth in my own village of St. Mary, Mead. There was a couple, much like the Colonel and Mrs. Wentworth, though not nearly so well regarded. He was a philanderer, and she a very quiet, patient woman. Everyone felt so sorry for her. She paused to sip her tea. Lavinia's eyes were fixed on the middle distance, but a faint tension had crept into her jaw. One day, Miss Marple continued, the husband was found dead in his barn, a pitchfork through his chest. It looked like a dreadful accident. He had fallen from the loft, you see. The whole village believed it. But there was one curious detail. A single, long, grey hair was found caught on a nail near the body. The poor widow's colour. Lavinia Wentworth went very still, her hands in her lap, tightened until the knuckles were white. Of course, Miss Marple went on. Everyone said it proved nothing. She was often in the barn. But I always wondered. You see, the local constable, a thorough man, found that the bolt on the barn door, which was also found locked from the inside, had a tiny, almost invisible groove filed into its track. A piece of strong thread could be looped through it, the bolt shot from the outside, and then the thread pulled away, leaving the appearance of a locked room. It was a very clever trick. But the thread broke, leaving a single strand behind, and the hair, well, the hair was from the head of the patient, quiet wife, who had finally grown tired of waiting. The silence in the room was absolute. The vicar looked bewildered. Mrs. Havisham's eyes were wide with dawning comprehension. Lavinia did not move, but a single treacherous muscle twitched near her eye. That is a most disturbing story, Miss Marple, the vicar said, his voice uneasy. It is the nature of human patience, Vicar, Miss Marple replied, her gaze resting gently on Lavinia. It can be a virtue, but it can also be a weapon. It allows one to wait for the perfect moment, to plan every detail, to poison a cup days in advance, knowing it would be used, or to stage a suicide, knowing a grieving widow would be above suspicion. Lavinia's head snapped up. Her eyes, dry and burning, met Miss Marple's. There was no grief in them now, only a cold, defiant fury. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "I dare because two people are dead, Lavinia," Miss Marple said, her tone still gentle but now unyielding. "One by a subtle, cunning poison, the other by a brutal shot. They seem like different crimes, don't they? But they are connected by a single, patient thread. The thread of a woman who would not be cast aside." "You have no proof," Lavinia hissed, her composure cracking. "It is all the rambling of a malicious old woman." "Proof can be found," Miss Marple said calmly. "A search of your home might reveal the file used to groove the bolt on the potting shed, or the spool of strong thread, or perhaps the receipt from a shop in Market Basing for a substance not meant for gardening. Inspector Drew is a thorough man. He will know where to look once his eyes are pointed in the right direction." It was then that Lavinia broke. The years of quiet endurance, the bitterness, the calculated rage, all came pouring out. She did not confess, not in so many words, but she stood up, her body trembling with a violent energy, and pointed a shaking finger at Mrs. Havisham. "She drove him to it," Lavinia cried, her voice rising to a shriek. "With her money and her paints and her simpering ways, he was going to leave me penniless for that. That child, but it wasn't enough to stop him. I had to stop her. I prepared the cup days before, when I knew she would be helping with the flowers. I knew which one she favored. It was easy. And Arthur, poor, foolish Arthur, he guessed. He found the cyanide I'd taken from his own old photography supplies. He confronted me. He was going to turn me in to protect that girl's memory. So I took him to the shed, to talk. And I used his own gun. The locked room was simple. A child could have done it. She stood there, panting, her secret laid bare not in a courtroom, but in the vicar's drawing room, before the three people who represented the society she had sought to manipulate. The vicar stared in horror. Mrs. Havisham had a hand clamped over her mouth. Lavinia's eyes, wild and unfocused, swept over them. "He was mine," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a hollow shell. "He was always mine, and no one was going to take him from me." She sank back into her chair, her story told. The trap had sprung, and the quarry was caught. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply looked at the broken woman, her heart filled with a profound and weary sadness. The patient, quiet wife had, in the end, been the most dangerous of them all. The drawing room was frozen, a tableau of shock and horror. Lavinia Wentworth's confession seemed to hang in the air, a poisonous vapor that had finally dissipated to reveal the grim truth beneath. The vicar had half risen from his chair, his face a mask of pallid disbelief. Mrs. Havisham sat rigid, her dramatic instincts utterly failing her in the face of such raw domestic evil. It was at this moment that the door to the drawing room opened, and Inspector Drew stepped in, his expression grimly satisfied. He was followed by a uniformed sergeant. They had been waiting in the hall, having been discreetly summoned by the vicar at Miss Marple's earlier private request. "Lavinia Wentworth," the inspector said, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "I'm arresting you for the murders of Clarissa Webb and Colonel Arthur Wentworth. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Lavinia did not look at him. Her defiance had evaporated, leaving only a numb emptiness. She offered her wrists for the handcuffs as if in a trance, her eyes fixed on some distant, ruined point in her past. As she was led away, the spell in the room broke. But how?" the vicar stammered, collapsing back into his armchair. "Jane, how did you know?" Mrs. Havisham found her voice, a tremulous whisper. "Yes, for heaven's sake, explain. I feel quite faint. To think we were sitting here with a murderess." Miss Marple, who had remained perfectly composed throughout the ordeal, took a small, neat sip of her tea. It was a matter of seeing the pattern, Vicar, and of understanding that the most obvious picture is not always the correct one. We were all so quick to see a jealous spinster or a tragic romance, but the truth was far more mundane and far more terrible. It was about money and the quiet, desperate fear of being left with nothing after a lifetime of service. She placed her cup back on its saucer with a soft click. The first clue was the method. The poison was in the cup itself, not in the tea. That meant the murder was not an act of spontaneous opportunity on the lawn, but a cold, premeditated one. It required access to the vicarage and knowledge of which cup Clarissa would use. Who had such access? We all did to some extent, but who had a motive that was powerful enough to warrant such careful planning? "Miss Hartwell," the vicar began. "Miss Hartwell's motive was jealousy over a position in the church," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "It was a hot, passionate emotion. The poisoning was a cold, calculated act. They did not match. Then there was Colonel Wentworth. His affection for Clarissa was clearly deep, but his motive for killing her was obscure. Remorse after the fact? Perhaps, but it did not feel right." She turned her gaze to the empty chair where Lavinia had been sitting. It was Lavinia who provided the key, though she did not know it. She confessed to me in the church that the colonel was going to change his will, to leave a bequest to Clarissa. For a woman who had spent her life as a ghost in her own life, as she put it, that was not just an insult. It was a threat to her very survival. It was a motive for a patient, planning mind. But the final piece, Miss Marple continued, was the colonel's death, the apparent suicide. It was too convenient. It wrapped everything up too neatly. And there was the grey hair in the shed. But more than that, there was the nature of the shot. A soldier like the colonel would know how to make a sure job of it. A shot to the temple is messy and uncertain. And then I remembered the shell casing. "The shell casing?" Inspector Drew asked, his notebook in hand. He was no longer condescending. He was a student at the feet of a master. "There were two," Miss Marple explained. "One was by the colonel's body in the shed. The other I saw him place on Clarissa's grave the night before he died. A soldier's tribute, it was a gesture of true, profound grief. A man planning to kill himself out of remorse might visit a grave, but he would not leave a part of his weapon there beforehand. It was a farewell, not a prelude to suicide. He was mourning her. That was all. When I saw the second casing in the shed, I knew it was a staged scene. The murderer, Lavinia, knew of his habit, his little tribute. She replicated it to strengthen the illusion of his guilt and remorse. The locked room was a simple trick, one I've seen before, using a thread and a filed groove in the bolt. She confessed as much. She killed Clarissa to secure her financial future, and she killed her husband when he discovered the truth and threatened to expose her. She used his own grief and his own gun against him. A long silence filled the room. The simplicity and the horror of it were overwhelming. But the cyanide? The vicar asked, his voice hoarse. Where did she get it? From the Colonel's own old supplies, Miss Marple said. He dabbled in photography in his younger days. Cyanide was used in certain developing processes. Lavinia would have known it was there, tucked away and forgotten. She had patience, you see. She waited for the right tool to come to hand. Mrs. Havisham shuddered. To think, all that time she was just sitting there, embroidering. Precisely, Miss Marple said, her tone final. She was always just sitting there, watching and waiting. And that, in the end, made her the most dangerous person of all. The rain that had threatened all week finally began to fall, a soft, steady drizzle that washed the dust from the leaves of St. Mead's and pattered against the window panes of the vicarage. Inside, the silence felt different now, cleansed of its poison, but heavy with a new, sober knowledge. Inspector Drew and his sergeant had departed, taking their grim charge with them. The dramatic tension had leaked away, leaving behind the stark, uncomfortable furniture of truth. Mrs. Havisham, after a restorative sip of the vicar's sherry, had been driven home in her motor car, her usual vivacity replaced by a pensive quiet. The vicar sat opposite Miss Marple, his head in his hands. To think she sat in my garden, in my home, that she broke bread with us. All the while, he couldn't finish the sentence. The capacity for darkness exists in the most unexpected places, Vicar, Miss Marple said, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the rain. It is not the flamboyant wickedness of a stage villain we must fear, but the slow, steady bitterness that grows in a neglected heart. Lavinia felt herself fading into the background of her own life. That is a terrible thing. It does not excuse her actions, of course, but it explains them. And poor Clarissa, the vicar mourned. She was just a pawn in their unhappy marriage, an innocent life, snuffed out for a few £1,000s. And for the illusion of respect, Miss Marple added. Lavinia could not bear the public humiliation of being cast aside for a younger woman, even posthumously. She killed to preserve her world as she knew it, a world that, I suspect, had been a prison to her for many years. Later, as Miss Marple walked home beneath her umbrella, the village seemed both familiar and strange. The cottages were the same, the gardens just as tidy, but the innocence was gone. Mrs. Darrow, seeing her from the shop window, gave a hesitant wave, her expression a mixture of awe and unease. The news would be all over St. Mead's by nightfall, and the name Wentworth would be spoken in hushed, scandalized tones for a generation. At the lich gate, she paused. Through the veil of rain, she saw two figures standing by Clarissa's grave. One was Beatrice Hartwell, released without fanfare from custody, her posture still rigid but her head bowed in what might have been respect, or perhaps a private apology. The other was a young man Miss Marple did not recognize, holding a simple bunch of wildflowers. He placed them on the fresh earth, stood for a moment, then turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire discreetly about him. Clarissa's letters from Market Basing, perhaps. had a face after all. Life, in its stubborn way, was already reasserting itself, weaving new threads into the torn fabric of the community. Back in her cozy cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle on the hob for her own cup of tea. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out at her rain-soaked garden. The case was solved, the murderer apprehended, yet she felt no sense of triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. She thought of Lavinia, now in a cell, her patience and planning come to this. She thought of the Colonel, whose late-in-life affection had sparked such catastrophe. And she thought of Clarissa, the quiet girl with a taste for poetry, who had seen a chance for a different life and had perished for it. It was a story as old as time, played out not in the headlines of great cities, but here, amidst the lavender and the roses. The same passions, love, jealousy, greed and despair, were present here in St. Mead's as anywhere else in the world. They were just better disguised. The kettle whistled its cheerful domestic tune. Miss Marple rose to make her tea. The world was full of evil, but it was also full of good. And it was the job of those who could see clearly to tend to the good and to prune back the evil, however, and wherever it grew. It was, she reflected, not so very different from gardening.